Thank you, and welcome to all in person and on the Zoom. Nice to see all of you. Thank you for being here. I thank Sarah and Julian for their very kind sponsorship, and it implies that there might be wisdom coming from me, so I hope I won't too disappoint too much, because you can say, in appreciation of the wisdom or lack thereof, maybe a safer way of saying it. But I do thank you. It was very, very kind and really nice to and appreciated. So the advantage of the topic I chose for the season, which were basically questions that people ask about Judaism. I said 6 questions. It made it, when I couldn't think of a specific topic, this gave me a chance to think of 6 topics. But, things that I think are connected by the fact that they are part of the curiosities that we wrestle with as Jews. And so the kickoff, as you have seen, is must a good Jew believe in God? And so I'm going to explore this from many angles. The people here have a handout in front of them. Those of you, I'm going to screen share for those who are on the Zoom the same handout, so you will not be disadvantaged. Because some of the texts we will look at together that will help us deal with this question, which is a question that's been wrestled for millennia, in a sense. It's not a new question. And to what extent is being a Jew, believing in God, essential to being a good Jew? Is it relevant at all, or is it totally not relevant? So I will begin by suggesting that looked at a book just came out, and it's hot off the presses, called Bad Jews. And I really just started reading it, so I haven't mastered all of it, but I will tell you that I'm going to read to you the flyleaf of the book, just to give you an idea of what's in here. And what suggests that in the index, in the table of contents of this book, there is no listing for God. In other words, belief in God is not even relevant to whether one is a good Jew or a bad Jew. It's just not even relevant. And then we'll see that consistent in many places, that is not what people consider. So what is this writer, Emily Tamkin, so this is coming, and even for me, this is coming from a fairly liberal to left-wing viewpoint, so it's not something that I necessarily identify with, but I'm very curious as to how this person understands and how do you determine who's a good Jew, who's not a good Jew? She's not giving her own opinion here, just to be fair. She's analyzing different aspects of society, focusing primarily on the U.S., but it obviously would apply beyond the U.S. as well. So I'm just going to read a brief intro from the flyleaf of the book. What does it mean to be a bad Jew? Many Jews use the term bad Jew as a weapon against other members of the community, or even against themselves. You can be called a bad Jew if you don't keep kosher, if you only go to temple, or synagogue, of course, on Yom Kippur, if you don't attend or send your children to Hebrew school, if you enjoy Christmas music, you could be a bad Jew then, if your partner isn't Jewish, if you don't call your mother often enough. That's, suggestions, and, this could define you as a bad Jew, but nowhere in this book of about 300 pages does the issue of believing in God have any relevance. Totally not, as we say in Hebrew, is a lo ba b'cheshbon. It's not even part of the consideration as to whether or not one is a good Jew or not. So it's irrelevant. In other words, so the question that the writer here the author would say, and the topic is, must a good Jew believe in God? And it's irrelevant. Who cares? That seems to be the case. Another book, which is not new, it's a few years old, but it's a lot of fun. It's called Bad Rabbi. It's all kinds of stories from the Jewish press going back 100 years. And different, it's not just about rabbis, it's about different kinds of Jews who are considered to be disreputable. One of the chapters is about a rabbi. That's where it gets the title Bad Rabbi. But It's about and you go through this entire book, which is, again, it's actually kind of fun. These are real articles that appeared in the Jewish press, mostly in Yiddish, in the early to middle years of the 20th century, primarily. Never, ever in this entire book does the issue of belief in God enter. Totally irrelevant. In other words, it has to do with your behavior, with how you get along with people, whether you're a good person ethically, and sometimes it's whether you perform mitzvahs, whether you keep kosher, whether you fast on Yom Kippur, and one of the chapters in that book is about this feast that would take place on Yom Kippur from Jews who considered themselves to be apikorsim, considered themselves to be heretics, and went out of their way to demonstrate that they weren't observant. And that was very common in Israel in the 1950s, on secular kibbutzim, on left-wing kibbutzim, where they would have dinner dances on Yom Kippur. That doesn't happen today pretty much at all, because Israel has matured to the point where secularists do not feel they have to be overtly anti-religious, but that was the case in the early years of the state. But again, it had to do with performing rituals, nothing to do with belief. Nothing to do with whether or not you believed in God. It was not part of the figure, of the consideration as to whether or not one was a good Jew. So I'm going to now look at those who are present. You have in the handout page 1, and I'm going to screen share for those who are watching diligently online. Give me a second here. Screen share. Okay. Okay, so 1 second. You don't need the first. Okay, this is the headings, which aren't, you don't get that right now. Okay, so here we have to spend a moment looking at two definitions of what it means to be a good Jew. One is from a very prominent Orthodox rabbi of blessed memory, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, passed away a couple of years ago. You all know of him. A tremendous force in the rabbinic world, and one who, a modern Orthodox rabbi who was, who's read very heavily in our community as well. His readings were read throughout the Jewish world, certainly not limited to the Orthodox world. And for many of the Orthodox, he was too liberal because he was very into interfaith relationships, etc. And some of the people in the more right wing of the Orthodox world did not find that comfortable. But here now, he gives a definition of what it means to be a good Jew. And you have this in front of you. Those of you here have it, the paper. So he writes, I am a Jew because our ancestors were the first to see that the world is driven by a moral purpose, that reality is not a ceaseless war of the elements to be worshipped as gods, nor history a battle in which might is right and power to be appeased. The Judaic tradition shaped the moral civilization of the West, teaching for the first time that human life is sacred, that the individual may never be sacrificed for the mass, that rich or poor, great and small are equal before God. So God is part of his definition, but at no point does he say essential to his being a Jew is that he believes in God. God is there, but there's no expressed requirement to believe in God. But and it's coming from an Orthodox rabbi. He's saying the primary focus of being a Jew, and in his view, being a good Jew, worthy of the heritage of the Jewish people, is basically adhering to the moral tradition that Jewishness implies. Okay, I'm a Jew because our nation, though at times it suffered the deepest poverty, never gave up on its commitment to helping the poor, or rescuing Jews from other lands, or fighting for justice for the oppressed, because it was a mitzvah, because the Jew could do no less. Proud to be part of a people, though scarred and traumatized, never lost their humor or their faith. One could imply here maybe there's the idea that a good Jew has to believe in God, although he doesn't say that expressly. Ability to laugh at present trouble, so being a good Jew means you have to have a sense of humor, and find Jackie Mason to be funny, Alava Shalom, and believing in ultimate redemption, who saw human history as a journey, never stopped traveling and searching. Okay, so that's Jonathan Sachs' understanding of what being a Jew is all about, and one can understand this, and I understand it as the recipe for being a good Jew, is that you adhere to all of these requirements, that you do noble acts in the world, that you accept our heritage, but there's no express saying a good Jew believes in God. That's not part of his expressed theology here. And now a very famous Zionist writer, Edmund Flagg, quoted by Arthur Hertzberg of blessed memory in the Zionist Idea, and he gives a definition here let me just on the screen show you this. He talks about what does it mean? What is the essence in his view of being a Jew? I'm a Jew because the faith of Israel demands of me no abdication of the mind, because being a Jew means that we emphasize intellectual acquisition, knowledge, learning. I'm a Jew because the faith of Israel requires all the devotion of the heart, because I'm dedicated to my tradition. I'm a Jew because in every place where suffering weeps, the Jew weeps. We commiserate with those who are suffering, who are in pain. I'm a Jew because every time when despair cries out, the Jew hopes. In other words, we don't lose our faith. We believe, we hope. We have a hope for a better tomorrow. I'm a Jew because for Israel, the world is not yet completed. People are completing it. We are engaged in tikkun olam, in bringing the world closer to shlemut, to completion. That's part of what being a Jew is all about. Again, belief in God is not essential to his definition. So, I'm going to unshare for a moment because I'm going to discuss something that's not part of the text in front of you. Just an interesting political note. I want to quote two American politicians of note. One who said something a couple of weeks ago, and one who said something, whose wife said something a few days ago. And the first figure I'm going to quote is former President Donald Trump, who attacked Jews in the U.S. on his Truth Social platform, writing, "They need to get their act together and appreciate Israel before it's too late. No president has done more for Israel than I have. Somewhat surprisingly, however, our wonderful evangelicals are far more appreciative of this than the people of the Jewish faith, especially those living in the U.S." And then he says, "But those living in Israel, that's an exception. There I have the highest approval rate in the world. I could be elected prime minister of Israel." That may be true, I don't know. I'm not going to go into the Israel elections tonight. That's too complicated and too challenging. But so the definition here of what a good Jew is, it's twofold. One is identified totally with being supportive of Israel, but in this case it has to be with supportive of Israel, at the same time recognizing one particular past president as the source of the greatest support for Israel. And I mean, I'm not going into American politics now. Trump was good for Israel. I'm not going to deny that. But that's his definition of it. And if you're not in that category of a Jew who is let's put it this way, a right-of-center Zionist, you're not a good Jew. That's the whole definition. Nothing to do with it. Obviously, God isn't part of this. So more interesting, and this is just to add something that just appeared. A couple of days ago, Rebecca Mastriano, who's the Rebbitzin of the Republican candidate for governor of Pennsylvania, who is competing against this guy Shapiro, who's Josh Shapiro, who's an observant Jew, a synagogue-attending, kosher-observant Jew, sends his kid to day school. Mastriano attacked him for sending his kids to an elitist private school, and then said he's not a good Jew. And without giving a definition as to why he's not a good Jew. So his wife filled in some of the details a couple of days ago and said, as a family, we so much love Israel. I'm going to say we probably love Israel more than a lot of Jews do. So again, here the idea of being a good Jew is being politicized by saying you're a good Jew if you hold to a certain ideology. And now from a Jewish source, Ben Shapiro, who tweets a lot, he's not known to be a liberal. And a quote from Ben Shapiro, and I'm just going to quote it without comment. "The Jewish people has always been plagued by bad Jews who undermine it from within. In America, those bad Jews largely vote Democrat." So now I'm not, I probably, again, I don't vote in American elections. There are times when I probably would have voted Republican, times when I would have voted Democratic. So I would be kind of, I would depend on the individual and on the times, on the circumstance, on the platform. So I'm kind of a centrist that could go either way. I guess they call those independents in the U.S. But I would say that to categorize a Jew or somebody of any religion based on their political affinity, by the politician they support, as a bad Jew is rather problematic, or as a good Jew, unless you had somebody running for office who was an avowed anti-Semite. If Ye or Yech, or whatever his name is, was running for president, he did run for president. Kanye ran for president. I would say if you voted for him, you're a bad Jew. That I would endorse. Well, he was a candidate for president for an hour and 10 minutes, I think. Not for very long, but I'm saying, unless you're having someone who's an extremist, a racist, or an avowed anti-Semite, or somebody who was really, but if you have a Democrat or Republican who are relatively in normal, one should not define one's Jewishness, you're a good or bad Jew. Okay, that's a side issue. We're not going to go into politics tonight, even though I just did for a couple of minutes. But I would just suggest that, again, the last thing that's being considered here by any of these individuals is one's ideology, one's theology. So let me bring an exception to that rule. I'm going to go back on screen again. Let me share this screen with our live audience, with our Zoom audience. 1 second. Okay, here we go. So I am showing you, and those who are in the room, page 2, Rambam Maimonides Sefer HaMitzvot. So Maimonides was one who made very clear that belief in God is integral to being a good Jew. It is essential to being a good Jew. And he says, basically, it is the very first mitzvah. And this is coming, the text I've just given you is from the Rambam, is from Maimonides' Sefer HaMitzvot. And there were several compilations in the Middle Ages of Sefer HaMitzvot, of books listing the commandments, 1 to 613. And he'll explain here how you get to the number 613, which is basically, it's a midrash. It's not something where the Torah didn't number the mitzvot and with 613. So various people come out with their compilation of what are the 613 mitzvot. And the Rambam says, this is mitzvah number 1. I'm just going to read the beginning in the original Hebrew. Hi ha-tzivui asher tzivanu b'ha'amanat ha'elohut. It is the command that He, God, commanded us to believe in God. V'hu she'na'amin sheyesh sham ale v'siba hu poel l'chol hanimtzaim. Here we get into heavy philosophy. We believe there is an origin and a cause, that He is the power of all that exists. So there is not that there is a mitzvah, a command that you have to believe in God. It is the first of all the 613 mitzvot. It's mitzvah number 1. It is a command. So in other words, if you are not believing in God, you are violating the primary mitzvah of Judaism, and therefore he would say you're not a good Jew. So Maimonides is very clear on this issue, and he gives us, and in the front of you have the text. I'm not going to go through every word of it, but basically the Gemara that teaches us where you get to 613. In other words, there's no enumeration of the commandments in the Torah. So 613 is it's a homiletical number. It's one that is surmised by the rabbis, but it's not based on a count. There's no head count of mitzvot in the Torah. But what happens is it's a midrash. There are the word mitzvah, the word Torah, the word Torah has a numerical value. Every Hebrew letter, as you know, has a numerical equivalent. And the gematria, the numerical equivalent of the Hebrew word Torah, is 611. See, and so where do you get the 613? So you add to 611 two of the commandments on I am the Lord your God, and then the next one, you shall have no other gods before me, the opening of the Decalogue, the 10 Commandments. These are the two mitzvot that the people of Israel heard directly from God, not through Moses, who was transmitting the other 611. So you have 611 represented by the word Torah, plus the two that all the people heard at the same time that Moses heard them. I'm the Lord your God, you shall have no other gods before me, equals 613. And those two additional commandments that all the people heard, I am the Lord your God, Ani Hashem Elokecha, I am the Lord your God, which means that's a mitzvah. It's a commandment to believe in God. So he says that's why it's the first commandment, because not only is it a commandment, but it's the one that all the people, everyone heard God's voice standing at Sinai. They all heard God say those words. It was very powerful, very dramatic, very exciting. They all heard it. So that is not only a mitzvah, but it is the first mitzvah. That's why it's number one in his book. Okay, now, Maimonides had a critic who lived in the 14th century, and Maimonides was 12th, 13th century. This is like a century later. His name was Chazdai Crescus, a major philosopher, not as famous as Maimonides, not known in the wider world, but very, he disagreed with Maimonides very strongly on this point, and I'm just going to look at this really quickly. It's rather heavy and complicated. And he says he's wrong. Belief in God cannot be a mitzvah, which, by the way, in terms of our theme tonight, would suggest that if it's not a mitzvah, if it's not then one perhaps could be a good Jew without believing in God, because it's not a mitzvah, and ultimately we are commanded to do mitzvot. That's what is expected of us. We're not, by knowledge, it's not belief that's commanded, it's action, it's mitzvot. It's not a mitzvah. According to Maimonides, you have to be a believer in God to be a good Jew, and Crescus not so quick. So he says his logic here is the following: that in order for a commandment to be a command, you have to have a commander, and God is the commander behind all the mitzvot. That's self-evident. So if there was a commandment to believe, there'd have to be a commander standing behind that commandment. So it doesn't make it, and this goes, it's like reductio ad absurdum. It would go back, to infinity. You'd never be able to complete it. There'll always be a commander standing behind. So it doesn't make sense to say that it's a commandment, because every commandment implies that there's a commander. Otherwise, there wouldn't be a commandment. Every mitzvah requires that there is a mitzvah, one who gives the mitzvah, the commandment. And so God is obviously there, but it's not a mitzvah to believe, because it doesn't make logical sense. Crescus disagrees with Maimonides. So we're not going to vote on who's right here or who's wrong. They're both very smart people. They're no longer living. But it is clear that, that according to Maimonides, one has to believe in God in order to be what we would consider today to be a good Jew, because it's fundamental. It's the primary mitzvah. You can't, if you're not observing mitzvot, that impacts upon your Jewishness. If you don't do mitzvot, it's hard to. It does impact upon the quality of your Jewishness. If you never do a mitzvah, you're not a terrific Jew. So you can't avoid the primary mitzvah according to Maimonides, and Crescus has nothing to do with you being a good Jew. Of course, logic tells you. Crescus says it doesn't make sense not to believe in God. It's logical. It doesn't make sense not to believe in God, but it. Don't assume that, but it can't be a mitzvah, because a mitzvah requires a commander who's obviously going to be there anyhow, so he's already there. You don't need there can't be a mitzvah. It wouldn't make any sense. Okay, enough with medieval philosophy, but you get the idea that it's controversial. The idea of is belief a mitzvah, or is belief in God a mitzvah, or is it just there? And primarily, I like to, I'll just unshare for a minute, because I'm going to just yen for a while here. One of the, clearly one of the the basic idea of a mitzvah is that it commands an activity. It's something. It's an action. You do something. I used to often like to tell this. I used to watch years ago. I don't know if he's still alive even, but I used to often many years ago, when I really was bored and it was pre-internet and you didn't have what to do and you didn't go on, you didn't go online, you didn't, whatever. So I used to sometimes watch Jimmy Swaggart. who was one of these prominent evangelical preachers, until he got caught in an affair with his secretary, with his, I think, teenage secretary. So he got caught in scandal, which happened to a lot of these guys. And then he fell off the evangelical map, as it were. But I remember watching him. I used to kind of watch him because he was a great preacher. Like, when I was in rabbinical school, trying to learn technique, like speaking technique. He was a great speaker. I mean, his stuff was Michigan, but he said it really well. You almost believed him. I mean, he said it really well. But I remember him saying that what in the Christian view at that point, we speak of the world to come. They speak of salvation, being saved. And he said, there's only one way to be saved as a Christian, and that is accepting Jesus. That's how you're saved. That's the only way. Nothing to do with action. You could be an axe murderer. And you wouldn't say, well, you could be a Nazi, but if you accept Jesus, you'd be saved. Nothing to do with your behavior. It was just belief that mattered. And that, to me, determined that I could never be an evangelical. Because Judaism teaches the opposite. Judaism says, in a way, God doesn't care what you believe. What matters is what you do. You can't be a horrific person and just have the right core belief and everything is forgotten. Basically, it's either it's what you do, or the fact that you do tshuva, that you repent when you've done something wrong, or when you haven't done mitzvah. But it's the action, it's what you do that makes the world a better place. Not what you think. Who cares what you think? It's what you do. And so I've never done a study of this, but I surmise that if you were to go, maybe we'll send other people to investigate, but if you were to go to 100 Orthodox shuls and try to see how many times does the rabbi give a sermon on the topic of God. And I would say that probably never happens. It would be very rare. Frankly, I rarely spoke about God. It wasn't one of my big sermon topics either. And go find out how many times Orthodox rabbis will speak about mitzvahs. And that'll be every Shabbos, every Yom Tov. That'll be constant about mitzvot. And that's kind of the pattern that I would follow. I mean again, mitzvot, both moral and ritual. That's what a traditionalist rabbi would do. Go to a Reform congregation, go to a Reconstructionist congregation. I don't mean to be disparaging here. They talk about God all the time. Belief is very central because mitzvot are not as important. I mean, they talk about morality, like ethical mitzvot, which we saw that Jonathan Sachs talks about, and that's cool. But they're not going to talk about ritual mitzvot. It's not. But God, belief is very big. So the more liberal you are on the spectrum, the more you're going to talk about God. The more traditionalist you are on the spectrum, the less you're going to talk about God. Belief is less important, and action is what matters. So, in a sense, that's what Kreskis is saying. Maimonides was a big believer in mitzvahs. He wrote Sefer HaMitzvot, the book of mitzvot, big believer in mitzvot. But he felt that belief was also part of that system. You had to believe. That was fundamental to accepting Torah, was a belief in God. So that is clearly, but the reality is that we're much more focused on action than on belief. Therefore, and in education, we're not. I'm occasionally on Batei Din, on rabbinic tribunals with candidates of conversion. And the last couple, especially since I've retired, I'm not really sponsoring my own candidates right now, but I will serve with other rabbis occasionally when they ask me to be on a Beit Din. And so one rabbi who's on the circuit, who I'm often, drives me meshigeh. And I hope this is being recorded. But I'm not mentioning any names. I'm not mentioning any names. But one rabbi drives me meshigeh because he starts asking questions about God. And I want to say, who cares? It sounds like, I want to ask, what do you do Shabbos? Tell me about, what does it mean? How do you make a kitchen kosher? Tell me about Pesach. What are the things you have to prepare? Tell me about how do you find something in the Siddur? I don't want to ask about, what do you think about God? Who cares? But that's a traditionalist point of view, but this other rabbi is always asking about God, and I'm looking at my watch, and on my watch I can check email, so it's really good. No, they don't realize I'm checking email when they're asking about God, and I'm really not interested in what the candidate's going to say, because what's the right answer to say about God? But that's never really been a major push in traditionalist Judaism. It doesn't, by the way, mean nowhere I'm saying that it's not considered good or sensible or logical or important to believe in God, but it's usually not the fundamental definition of what being a Jew is all about. And therefore, one could say that it is not, one can be likely considered to be a good Jew if one does a lot of wonderful Jewish acts, a lot of mitzvot, moral and ritual and ethical, and does a whole gamut of mitzvot and really tries to be a learned Jew and studies, but has questions about God. That will usually not factor in whether one is defining as, and by the way, I'm very, as you know, I'm very committed to Israel and a very strong line in terms of support of Israel. But I will not define being a good Jew, solely based on one's politics in terms of Israel. Like if one supports AIPAC, which I do, one is a good Jew. If one supports J Street, which I don't, one's a bad Jew. I won't say that, but I will say if one invalidates Israel as a Jewish homeland or is detrimental in his behavior, or her behavior toward the strengthening of Israel, or speaks badly about Israel in the war, then I would be very happy to define that person not in the good Jewish category at all. But in general, what's fascinating is that the question of God's place in defining what being a good Jew is all about is rather ambiguous. So I'm going to look at a couple other things, then I'm going to see if there are questions in the live audience or the online audience. I've given you something here which we're not going to look at in great detail. It's page 4 for those who are here, and it's what's on the screen for those who are watching on Zoom. This is a chapter that's headed God, which is a good, tells that it makes a point. It comes from a publication that is largely forgotten, which I did in 1988. We studied it in my Wednesday night class because it was just published by the conservative movement, by the Rabbinical Assembly and the Jewish Theological Seminary in 1988. And they published a pamphlet called Emet ve'emunah. Basically, it was a statement of conservative Jewish ideology. It made a great impact, so it's out of print and nobody remembers it ever existed, but it had great impact. I can't find my copy. If I had a copy of it, I spent an hour searching through my office. I don't know if I threw it out or gave it away. I can't find it, so it's not been part of my life. But I did keep a photocopy from when I taught that course back in 1988, 89, of the section on God. And I've given you that here quickly. No, I have a couple of people who just joined the class, excuse me. And so I'm just going to very quickly look at the underlined parts here, which are the main points. I'm not going to read the whole thing with you because it's boring. So basically, this is the conservative statement of what happened is that the Rabbinical Assembly and JTS brought together about a dozen leading rabbis and scholars and academics. They went on a retreat, and they spent a few days together, and they talked about ideology. And then they came out of this, they published this 40-page pamphlet, which again had great impact in the world for about 10 minutes. But in that idea of trying to come up, what is the conservative movement's ideology about God? So I'll just look at quickly the underlying points here. Judaism cannot be detached from belief in or beliefs about God. Okay.
Rabbi, you haven't shared?
God is integral to Judaism. Okay, fine. God is also a source of great perplexities and confusions. Look, there's no one view of God. Okay, that's true.
Rabbi, you're not sharing it.
Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you. I forgot. Oh, I'm sorry. I forgot to reshare. I'm sorry. Thank you Anna. Thank you. I'm getting out of the Zoom habit. And that's because okay. 1 second. Let me share. I apologize for not sharing. Thank you Anna very much I need to be reminded of these matters. Okay, now you see it. Okay, do the Zoomers see it? I'm not calling you boomers, I'm calling you zoomers.
Yes, we see it.
You see it? Perfect. Okay. Sorry. Thank you for the reminder. Now I remember to share again. I have to be sharing. It's important. It's a mitzvah. So here we have, okay. So now you see the underlying parts here. God is the source of great. Okay. One can live fully and authentically as a Jew without having a single satisfactory answer to such doubts about the existence of God. But you can't live a thoughtful Jewish life without having asked the questions. So the idea, you can't be a thoughtful Jew if you didn't come to tonight's class. So does God exist? If so, what sort of being is God? Does God have a plan for the universe? Does God care about me? Does he hear prayer? Does God allow the suffering of the innocent? Okay, a lot of questions about God, very problematic, and we'll get to some of those if we still have time later in the hour. So conservative Judaism affirms the critical importance of belief in God, but does not specify all the particulars of that belief. Certainly belief in a Trinitarian God, that's like the Catholics believe in, or in a capricious, amoral God can never be consistent with Jewish tradition and history. We won't argue that. But for many of us, belief in God means faith that a supreme, supernatural being exists and has the power to command and control the world through his will. So basically, some view the reality of God differently. The existence of God is not a fact that can be checked against evidence, the starting point for our entire view of the world and our place in it. So enough from Emet ve'emunah, but the idea here that sort of an ambiguous statement saying belief is part of Jewish heritage and tradition, but there's no fundamental exact definition of what that entails. Unlike the Jimmy Swaggart point of view, who's very specific about what that means, and how one is damned if you don't have that exact point of view as to what that definition is all about. So, one second, let me just find okay, there we go. Okay, enough from Emet ve'emunah. So, we see here, I'm going to look at a couple of other things, then I'm going to open to discussion. So hold on to your questions if you have any. I do want to read something brief. Yeah, here it is. From a recent book published posthumously by Elie Wiesel, some of his writings that were put together by one of his students after Elie Wiesel's passing. And I'm just going to read a paragraph from this book. I'm going to get something that Elie Wiesel wrote earlier in a few moments. And he tells a story in his chapter called God in the Torah. And this is the book called Filled with Fire and Light. It's the newest book by Elie Wiesel. Again, it's published posthumously. It's written. It came out just last year, and obviously he passed away a few years ago. But it was a collection of writings that had never been published. And so he writes in this chapter, in his dream, an old man, a wanderer, spoke to him. I'm not going to take that. Goes back to what's said previously. And the person says, "You seem sad. Why are you sad?" "I will tell you," answers the dreamer. "Since childhood I have studied God's words, have lived with them and by them. But I've never heard his voice. He speaks to everyone. Why doesn't he speak to me?" "How do you know that he hasn't?" "Well, I didn't hear him." "Are you sure? Have you ever heard the chirping of birds? Were you moved? How can you be certain that this wasn't God's voice?" The dreamer was now wondering whether he was in a dream, and the wanderer continued, "And the thunder, have you heard the thunder?" "Yes, I have." "Has it occurred to you that this might have been God's voice too?" "No, it hasn't." "And what about the voice you hear right now? How can you be sure whose it is?" The dreamer awoke with a smile. His melancholy was gone. Typical Elie Wiesel, a beautiful story, very powerfully sets the idea that we don't know how God manifests himself, God's self, because we're trying not to attribute gender to God. So we don't know. And that's, Elie Wiesel, and I'm going to talk briefly about him because he's a very interesting personality. He goes through a period of rejecting of God after the war, understandably, then comes back to a tradition and left this world as a practicing modern Orthodox Jew. Shomer Shabbos and everything else, but certainly wasn't that way when he wrote Night immediately after the Shoah and the decimation that he experienced and that his family experienced during those terrible, terrible years. So what I want to look at now, give me a second just to get my outline here. What I want to look at now is challenges to belief. In other words, I think I've posited to this point that it's good to believe in God, but it's not the defining aspect of whether one is a good Jew or not. And that's clear. All these books about bad Jews never mention God. It doesn't talk about God. Is not relevant to that discussion. I think we have to be very careful how we define bad Jews altogether, or good Jews, but clearly God is part of the picture, but it is not the be-all and end-all of how we define what being a good Jew is all about. So I've given you here, and time is not going to allow me to go through this in great detail, but for those who are in live presence here, those who are sitting in the room with me, and for those on the Zoom, we're not set up that I can show you. You can't see us. You can only see me. Sorry about that. But there are about a dozen people who are in the room in the Sisterhood Hall. You remember that room downstairs in the shul? And we have cookies and refreshments and cold drinks. So it's been a long time. Yes, it's been a long time that we've sat together. So it's page 7 for those who are in the live in-person audience. So this is a translation from a page in the Talmud Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud, tractate Chagiga, and whereas the Babylonian Talmud, the pages are enumerated by daf, like it would be Lamed Aleph Amud Bet, 31b or 31a, but in the Jerusalem Talmud, it's categorized like the way the Mishnah is, chapter 2, Mishnah 1, or section. That's how it. So this is the Jerusalem Talmud Chagiga, and Chagiga, the Yerushalmi is really great when it comes to studying Agadah, or the narrative portions of Talmud. It's not as legally valuable as the Babylonian Talmud, but in terms of Agadah, in terms of the narrative aspect, like the stories and the history, and it's a very, very valuable source. So this is a story of Rabbi Meir and his teacher Elisha ben Abuya. Very famous series of stories here on this page. He's sitting and preaching in the study house in Tiberia in Tiberias. By the way, Tiberia, that's where the Jerusalem Talmud was written. It wasn't written in Jerusalem. So the Yerushalmi, I don't know why it's called the Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud, not written in Jerusalem, but in Tiberias, in Tiberia. Interesting curiosity. Why is it called the Yerushalmi? I have no idea. But that's what it's called. So he's sitting in the Beis Midrash in the Talmud, the house of study in Tiberia. Elisha, and he's, it's on Shabbos. They're learning in the yeshiva on Shabbos. His teacher, Elisha, is passing by riding on his horse. I am told that this is the only place in the entire Talmudic literature where a rabbi rides a horse. And he does so on Shabbos, when it would be forbidden. So clearly evidence that his teacher became a non-believer. He abandoned his belief in God and became a heretic. So the students they come and say, your teacher's outside. He's on his ferret, he's outside. So he goes out to greet his teacher. It was powerful here, he still respects his teacher, even though his teacher has gone to the dark side and become a heretic. And so he says, and they're walking on, I've cut out a lot, it's a very long text, I've cut out, you see the 4 dots, meaning I've cut out a lot of the text. So he's walking alongside, his teacher's riding the horse, and Rabbi Meir is walking alongside the horse, basically studying Torah with his teacher. Kind of amazing. Can you imagine this scene? It's an incredible scene. And so then Elisha says to his teacher, to his student, he says, Meir, stop. This is the end of the Shabbos boundary. You can't walk further because it's Shabbos. I mean, he's riding his horse and he doesn't care. His student is still a Shomer Shabbos. He says, you have to stop. So Rabbi Meir says, how do you know? how do you know this is the end of the boundary? He says he's counting the horse's hoofs. 2,000 cubits, that's the end of the boundary. And so he knows exactly how to count the end of the Shabbos boundary. It's very impressive. Counting the horse's hoofs. 2,000 cubits, he counts the horse's footsteps. And so Rabbi Meir says to him, Kol chachmata itabach, I remember the Aramaic, all this wisdom you have within you, and you don't do tshuva? Come back. We miss you. You know so much. You're a living Torah. How can you not come back to observe and believe? He says, I can't. He says, what do you mean you can't? He says, and he tells the story. Once I was walking past the Kodesh Kodeshim, the Holy of Holies, on Yom Kippur, which fell on Shabbos, the holiest of holy days, and I heard a voice coming from the Holy of Holies, saying, Shuvu banim shovavim, return, O you erring children, a quote from the prophet Jeremiah. And I heard a voice coming from behind the Holy of Holies that says, you can all come back except for Elisha ben Abuya, sheyada kochi umarad bi, who knew my strength and yet rebelled against me. So according to Elisha, here's this voice from on high, a voice from the heavens which says everybody can come and repent, but not you, Elisha, because you should have known better. You're a Torah scholar and you rebelled against, you abandoned belief in me. This is God speaking, of course. Here's that voice. So he said, I can't do tshuva. And my teacher, the late Rabbi Lieberman, used to say that Elisha's biggest sin was that he believed that voice was from God. That he should have known that he could have done tshuva, which is a very interesting comment. But then the text goes on to explain what happened. What happened? They're trying to understand what made this guy how did he lose his faith in God? And he tells there are a bunch of different explanations, which means we don't know the answer. So you come up with different scenarios. So one of the stories, a very famous story, is that he sees somebody fulfilling the mitzvah of shiluach haken, of sending away the mother bird. When you take the eggs from a nest, the Torah tells us in Deuteronomy that you have to send away the mother bird so the mother doesn't see you taking her eggs. He sees somebody taking the eggs without sending away the mother bird, violating the mitzvah, and he climbs down from the tree and he's fine. The next day he sees somebody fulfilling the mitzvah who sends away the mother bird, climbs up the tree, falls down and kills himself. And he says, I'm sorry, this version is he's bitten by a snake. And he says, the Torah says that if you do this mitzvah, you're going to have a long life. And he says, what happened to this guy's long life? The guy who doesn't do the mitzvah prospers. The guy who does the mitzvah is killed in the process of doing this mitzvah. So he said the Torah is not true. In other words, this is proof to me that the Torah is not true. And then the Gemara goes on to say they didn't understand the teaching of basically the teaching of Rabbi Yaakov that says when it says that you're going to have a reward, it's talking about the world to come. Okay, and then he gives another explanation that he sees the tongue of Rabbi Yehuda, the baker, in the mouth of a dog. In other words, this is a Torah scholar whose tongue is during persecution. He was butchered, and then the dog is chewing on his tongue, and he says that's horrible suffering of a Torah scholar causes him to lose his faith in God. So what we see here are examples of. Sorry, my computer's acting up. 1 second. Just give me a second here. Let me shut down the program. Okay. Sorry. I hope you're not seeing this. You might be seeing this on the Zoom. Oh no, good, it's gone. Baruch Hashem. So the idea being here that that causes, those are explanations why he lost his faith, and then the Rabbi Meir believes he does tshuva when he dies, but we're not going to go into that. But it's a very powerful Talmudic text in the Yerushalmi. The idea of explaining, you have a guy who's a rabbi becomes a heretic, disavows his belief in God, but his student Rabbi Meir still respects him. In other words, he still wants him to be part of the totality of good Jews. And he doesn't give up on him. And he believes he does tshuva when he dies, and that would make him again returning to the Jewish people after death. So the idea of being not willing to give up on a Jew, and this is coming from one of the great sages of the Mishnaic period, one of the great Tanaim, Rabbi Meir, who never abandons faith in his teacher, is not prepared to abandon a Jew, even when that Jew abandons belief in God. So I think part of this Gemara is an opening to discuss faith after the Holocaust. We're doing this for 5 minutes. It could be the entire session, but the idea of how that horrific experience of our people in the 20th century caused many to lose their faith. And I did mention that Elie Wiesel, when he came out of the war, when he wrote Night, was extremely angry. The original version of Night is not the shortened version that's available today. It's still in print, constantly reprinted in like 1 million languages. The original one was only in Yiddish, and it was much longer. I'd love to get a copy, and I don't know if I've always tried to find a copy of the original version, which is a very angry book, very angry at God. In other words, willing to, they say, God, get out of my life. Very angry, but he gets over that in time, and he returns to God and becomes an enthusiastically observant Jew. So here's the next page, page 9, for those who are sitting here live, and those who are live on the Zoom. It's the page in front of you now, and I'm still sharing, thankfully. So this is something that I've quoted in a sermon a couple of times back a few years ago, a very famous story that Elie Wiesel would tell. And this is in the category of, Elie Wiesel evidently once said this, that there are two kinds of stories. There's a true story, and there's a true story that really happened. So this might be in the category of a true story, I don't know, because it seems to be a bit legendary, but it's a great story anyhow. So let's assume it happened. He talks about a great Rosh Yeshiva from Poland was once my work companion. I never knew his name because no one ever knew anyone's name. This is in Auschwitz. Page 9. Is it page? Sorry, page 8. Page 8, forgive me. Page 8, yeah. Page 8. A great Rosh Yeshiva in Poland was my work companion. I never knew his name. No one here knew anyone's name. Don't remember his face. We all had the same face. I remember his voice. First day we began working together, we said, listen, not to study is a sin, even here. Since we worked together, let's study together. We had no books, no Talmud, but he knew everything by heart. I had learned a little Talmud before, so we began studying. I never stopped studying, not even there. One day he said, don't go to your place, stay with me. I stayed with him. I do not know why, but I soon found out he and two colleagues, also great masters in Talmud and Halacha, convened a rabbinic court, a Beit Din of law, to indict the Almighty. They were putting God on trial. And Wiesel has a book that he wrote a play called The Trial, which is expanding this story. He wanted me to witness it, to be there. I remember every word, every phase of that trial. It lasted for several nights. Witnesses were summoned, arguments were heard, always in a whisper in order not to arouse suspicion and punishment from the others. The arguments, the arguments, why and how long will it last? At the end, after due deliberation, the tribunal issued its verdict. My teacher, my friend, was the one to pronounce it. Guilty. God is guilty. There was silence then that probably permeated the entire camp and the entire world, a silence that could be compared only to Matan Torah, the giving of Torah at Sinai, which the Talmud describes as a special silence. Then after a minute or an infinity of silence, he shook himself. This is the person who pronounced God guilty, and he said, now let's daven Ma'ariv. It's a wonderful story. And the idea that, in a sense, they've just convicted God of abandoning the Jewish people. In a way, perhaps one could say disavowing belief in God. I don't know if you can extend it to that point. But the next thing you do is Ham daven Ma'ariv. One has nothing to do with the other. You still do what a Jew does. So the determination is that you're going to daven Ma'ariv, irrelevant as to what your feelings about God are at that particular moment. And In night, and this probably goes back to the time when he was really angry. This is a very famous quotation on page 9 for those who are sitting with me in the room, and those of you at home, the page in front of you on the screen right now. This is the last screen that I'm sharing. And this is a very powerful description of Rosh Hashanah and Auschwitz. And he talks about davening that takes place. Baruch Hu Hashem Baruch, blessed be the Almighty, the voice of the officiating inmate had become audible. I first thought it was the wind. Blessed be God's name. Thousands of lips. They're davening Mariv. And they're doing Baruch Hu at the beginning of Mariv. Thousands of lips repeated the benediction, bent over like trees in a storm. Blessed be God's name. This is Wiesel reacting to that. Why would I bless him? Because he caused thousands of children to burn in his mass graves? Because he kept 6 crematoria working day and night, including Shabbat and the holy days? Because in his great might he created Auschwitz, Birkenau, Buna, so many other factories of death? I listened as the inmate's voice rose, the Baal Tefillah, the prayer leader, powerful yet broken, amid the weeping, the sobbing, the sighing of the entire congregation. In days gone by, Rosh Hashanah had dominated my life. I knew that my sins grieved the Almighty. So I pleaded for forgiveness. In those days, I fully believed that the salvation of the world depended upon every one of my deeds, every one of my prayers. But now I no longer pleaded for anything. I was no longer able to lament. On the contrary, I felt very strong. I was the accuser, God the accused. My eyes had been opened, and I was alone, terribly alone in a world without God, without man, without love or mercy. I was nothing but ashes now. But I felt myself to be stronger than this Almighty to whom my life had been bound for so long. In the midst of those assembled in prayer, I felt like an observer, like a stranger. Incredibly powerful words. And again, this goes back to his anger phase. Very early after the war, his very first book, which again was not where he was later in life when he really moved back towards active observance and very much engaged in Jewish religious life, but had this great period of anger and separation from God. So I hope that I'm going to speak for another minute and then see if in the next few minutes if anyone has any questions. I've already, the hour's almost up, so I won't go much longer. But I just want to suggest that the answer to the question of the first of the 6 questions people ask about Judaism was, must a good Jew believe in God? And my answer to that question that I'm going to leave you with is maybe. In other words, I'm going to reflect a certain, I think it is good for a Jew to believe in God. It is not a denial of his Jewish, it's to question that belief or to be challenged by that belief, because ultimately our judgment as to our goodness or lack thereof centers more in the traditionalist Jewish viewpoint on what we do more than on what we think. What we do is what has impact in the world, upon those we love, upon those we encounter in life. What we think does not in any way have that level of impact. Belief is very important for many, if not most of us, to direct us to do the right action. Belief is a motivation. It gives us hope, it gives us strength. But ultimately, it's what we do and not what we think that's going to make the difference in the world. There was a great, people often say, I'm a Jew at heart. And so one of my teachers used to refer to that as a cardiac Jew. I'm a Jew at heart. And there's a gastronomic Jew. I'm a Jew because I love bagels and lox and cream cheese and chopped liver. And by the way, that whenever when I talked about converts earlier, and when I first meet with a convert, and I would say, tell me what your connection to Judaism is to this point in your life. What do you know about? And it would be like, I really love bagels and lox. And that would always, my mind say, I don't want this. I say, that has to be improved, and we're going to send you to study, and you have to have a lot more contact with Judaism, because that's irrelevant. If you Jews come from Morocco, don't know from bagels and lox. It's irrelevant. I mean, that's very lovely, but it's not, and especially today, Tim Hortons says bagels. Bagels are no longer, have been taken away from them. They're all over the place. And you can get bagels with bacon and eggs, it's of course I think is an abomination, but that's another story. But that's not the definition. So ultimately, Being a cardiac Jew is not enough. Belief is really helpful. It's fundamental. I think I'm more of a Kreskasian. I'm more into Kreskis than into Rambam, and saying that belief makes a lot of sense, which is what Kreskis said. It makes a lot of sense. It's logical. It helps us better understand the world. But I'm not sure that I would agree with Maimonides and say it's the primary mitzvah, without which any other mitzvah really, that they all follow that one mitzvah. I kind of think Kreskis is right. So let me take a breather. I'm going to see if there, even though we're out of time, I'll see if anyone. I'll start with the screen, and then I'll see live if anyone. I could take one or two questions, and that will probably be it. I hope you'll forgive me for not. It's very hard to do questions when it's on live stream, when it's on Zoom. Okay, I don't see, which is fine. I'll see if anyone in the room has a question or a comment. It's either a really good sign when there aren't any questions, or a really bad. Oh, I have a question. The good sign is that everything was so explained so clearly. There's nothing you could possibly ask. The bad side is, well, that was a good schluff. So let's hope. Oh, I see. I have a question on the screen, and I have a live question. So I'm going to. Anna, please answer your question.
It's not so much a question for you to answer. It's one for me to answer, and I can't, because sometimes I find that I talk to God, and in other times I'm saying, do I really believe that someone's listening?
Well, that's the story from Elie Wiesel that I read earlier. That's exactly that story. That is the voice I'm hearing. Is that God's voice? Is it not? I don't know. That's why my answer to the question.
Sorry, I didn't hear.
My answer to the question is maybe.
I didn't hear what you were saying. I came in right at 7:30, so I probably missed what you were saying.
That was, I think I said it, but don't worry. Either I think it's a very good reaction, and it's a very appropriate reaction, because we don't know. I mean, but keep talking to God. It's like people who daven at the kotel. They often say, I'm talking to God, but it's like talking to the wall. But don't stop talking. Keep it up. Keep talking. And who knows? Who's to say that that God isn't listening, God answering? Maybe the music you're hearing, maybe the bird chirping is God, as that story that Wiesel tells us. Maybe that's the case. Don't give up, but keep on talking. Keep on.
I don't ask for answers.
Good.
I just talk.
There's a book that was written. It's a wonderful book. I have it in my library if I could find it, called She'elot U'Tshuva Min HaShamayim, Responsa from Heaven. It was a Rav in the late Middle Ages who wrote a book, a halachic book, and what he did is he would think of the question, go to sleep, and wake up with the answer. So he believed that God answered his questions in a dream. And it's very serious halachic issues. It's like, really serious ritual questions. So it's answers to questions from heaven. In other words, God giving that's not typical Jewish theology, by the way. That's not something that's mainstream. But it's an interesting book where it's really serious questions, like really technical questions. He'd go to sleep, with the question, and then you wake up with the answer. It's pretty good. That was pretty good sleeping. That was very helpful, very good dreaming.
I'm laughing because my mother Overshown, she was a seamstress, and when she had a problem with her sewing, she would go to sleep to think about it, and in the morning she would have the answer on what to do with the material. So that's why I was laughing. Same thing.
Well, there's truth to that in life too. Again, I would say that in the time when I don't do this as often as I used to, but when I would be preparing a sermon and I'd be working late into the night and I get stuck at a certain point. I just don't like what I've done, or I just haven't, how do I end this? The ending is very important in the sermon. So is the beginning and the middle, but the ending is very important because you have to bring together all of the points you're making and bring it together to a logical conclusion. If it's a good sermon, you're going to do that. The definition of a good sermon is can you summarize it in one sentence? If you can't, you failed, because you have to be. What did the rabbi talk about? Well, I don't know. He talked about this. It's failure. What did the rabbi? If you can answer, if it's clear, and that's part of. Sometimes I just feel that I've lost the train. I don't know how I'm ending. So I go to bed and I wake up in the morning. In the morning, I figure it out. You look at it with fresh eyes. So that's also helpful in a lot of things. That whatever you do, sometimes you can't. You're dealing with a scientific problem, with a challenge. You sometimes need that break. I do one of the things I do in retirement, and one of my leisure activities is the New York Times spelling bee puzzle. It's a word game that's in the New York every day. Get it online. Shabbos, I do it after Shabbos. It's my Saturday night treat. But I do this every day. They also have Wordle, which I do, but this is another word puzzle. But the spelling bee is one that I could spend. I do. It can take time, so I'll spend 20 minutes on it. Then I'm stuck. You have to come up with words from 7 letters. How many words can you make out of 7 letters? And 1 letter you have to use in every word. And it's tricky. It's difficult. Sometimes you have, and you get points, and you have to get a certain number of points to be a genius. Most of the times I'm a genius, so I'm very proud of the fact that the New York Times calls me a genius most of the times, not always. But I stopped doing it, and then hours later I look at it, then with fresh eyes I can, yeah, of course, that word too. So with anything, a lot of stuff in life, that does help us. And maybe God's giving me the answer. I don't know. Who knows? Maybe. Lucy, you wanted to ask a question?
It's brief. You spoke of serving from time to time on the Beit Din regarding conversion.
Right.
I was just curious, what percentage would be of people who are not in a relationship, like aren't converting to get married?
The ones that come to us, 10%. Most are for the purpose of marriage. Orthodox theory, in general, don't permit conversion for an ulterior motive, like for the sake of marriage. What sometimes happens in that case is people lie. They deny that there's a relationship when there is a relationship. We hold by the Talmudic principle that even mitoch shelo lishma balishma. Then even if something at the outset is not for its own sake, is not for a pure desire to convert, but for an ulterior motive, eventually it becomes for its own sake. In other words, the idea of lishma, for doing something like Torah lishma, studying Torah for its own sake, not because you're taking an exam, not because you're passing a course, but because you love to study, you want to study for the sake of doing the mitzvah of Talmud Torah, of study. That's Torah study for its own sake, not for an ulterior motive, not to pass a course, not to get a degree, not to prepare a class. That's not Torah lishma, that's Torah for a purpose. But even if it is, so the idea, even if you're doing it for a purpose, for an ulterior motive, you're still learning Torah. So ultimately it becomes for its own sake, even if it doesn't start that way. So that's how we view someone who's going to seriously undertake the process of conversion. Most are going to have a reason, a practical reason. I'm nervous, to tell you the truth, when somebody would come to me and say, Rabbi, we talk about dreams. I had a dream that I should be a Jew. Or God came to me and said, you should be a Jew. I'm saying, Gewalt. Spare me from this person, hey, save me. That scares me. Much healthier is, I met this guy, I met this girl. We love each other, we want to have a common religion, and I'm willing to convert. I'm more comfortable with that, even though it's not ideal because there's an ulterior motive. But we make it hard enough that the person really has to want to be Jewish. Doesn't always work. In other words, commitment isn't always 100%, but we're more realistic, I think, than people to the right of us who are very insistent that there be no relationship, or if you're in a relationship, you have to break up. Because I think there's a lot of deception that goes on there. I'd rather people and we have both partners come to the class. So we're recognizing the fact that this is a, Jewish guy and a non-Jewish girlfriend, vice versa. 80% of the candidates are women, probably because men have to undergo a procedure which women don't. So that's why most of the candidates that come for conversion, they're more women. And also the fact, by the way, that the woman's religion in Judaism determines the religion of the child. So if the father's not Jewish, the child will still be Jewish. That's a big factor, by the way. And often it means that the grandparents are directing, the traffic here and encouraging very strong, which I understand, and it's true. It's more complicated, when the mother is not Jewish in a relationship than when the father's not Jewish. When there's a child, it's more complicated from a Jewish point of view, no question. But Torah doesn't always make life easy. So the answer to the question is that most cut that it's usually not for the sake of purely wanting to be Jewish, and again, and often those cases scare me, frankly. It does happen sometimes.
Can I ask you a question?
Absolutely. Is that Bernie?
Yeah.
Please.
You mentioned the Holocaust, for example. Do we, if we're in a situation of that nature, do we as Jews have a responsibility to try and save our fellow Jew?
I think that where we can. I mean, we do have. The question is, if we're in a life and death situation, for example, the Shoah, are we obligated to save our fellow Jew if that person is in danger? Yes, but not at the cost of our own life. I mean, one is not expected to give up your life to save another person. You're allowed to preserve yourself first. You're allowed to. You're not expected to be such a tzaddik that you're going to give up your own life to save another person. It's not forbidden, but you're not required to. That's not an obligation. That would be an unrealistic obligation. But if you can do it not at the cost of your life, yeah, then you're obligated to. It's part of you as a human being.
I raised that because you raised the question of politics. And if we look back to the Holocaust and we look at the United States, where Franklin Delano Roosevelt did all in his power to prevent saving Jews. And unfortunately, from my understanding, is he was encouraged by fellow Jews to prevent Jewish immigrants coming in. Where does that put them?
In those Jews who would discourage rescuing of Jews during the Holocaust would not be good Jews in my view. They would make it, front and center in my book of bad Jews. I think that's clear. And there's no shortage of that. There's no shortage of you have I'm blanking on the name now. It's late and I'm getting old, but we have this linguist. What's his name? Thank you, Noam Chomsky. Who has a Hebrew name, who's an anti-Semite, virulently anti-Israel. I mean, not just not left-wing anti, but really very detrimental, very hostile to the existence of the state of Israel.
And before it was popular too.
Sorry?
Before it was popular.
Yeah, no, he was going back up, 50, 60 years. His whole life has been. There's another, he has a cousin who's the same name, maybe it's a brother, who wrote a book on the Hebrew language, who's a Zionist. That would be, no question about that. Somebody who is, avidly hostile to Jews or to Jewish survival, no question. That to me is open and shut. There are cases of ambiguity. It's one's politics are more liberal or more traditional. Like I would not, I would say that a Satmar Chassid who's anti-Israel to me is a bad Jew. I mean, he's as firm as they come. I mean, he's firmer than God. But to me, that's clear cut. I mean, I have my red lines as to what, but I'm very cautious about that. And there are people who I will disagree with vehemently, politically, on matters related to Israel or other matters, but they have to really cross a red line in terms of being avidly hostile and detrimental to the survival of the Jewish people or the state of Israel. That to me they would clearly make it in my book of bad Jews, 100%. Look, by the way, I will not, part of the book of bad Jews that Emily Tamkin has written, that just came out last month, she's intermarried. So that, certainly gets a right-wing audience not too happy about her. She has a chapter on intermarriage, and are you a bad Jew if you intermarry? In my younger years, I may have thought so. I do not believe so today. You're a Jew who fell in love with a non-Jew. I'm not saying what you did is great for the Jewish people. It's problematic. There's no question. It's challenging. But I'm not going to judge you on that one factor. I mean, it's problematic for the Jewish world, but there are a lot of people who do things that are problematic. But that doesn't, I would not say that crosses a red line. I would have once said that in my younger days, but I won't say that today. And I think most people, even people in the liberal Orthodox camp would not say that today. Yet a great, it was public knowledge, so I can mention a name. The late philosopher Emil Fackenheim, who lived in Toronto, was a member, not a, he's a member, he davened regularly at Shar Shamayim. davened in an Orthodox shul, was Shomer Shabbos. His wife was Catholic. Did Emil Fackenheim a bad Jew? I don't think so. His philosophy is very important. He was a survivor, and he wrote a lot about post-Holocaust theology. No, but I'm saying that one aspect of it, it was challenging. People do challenging things, but you have to be real. But I think there are times if you do something to endanger a Jewish life or any life, a Jew who murders a non-Jew, not a good Jew in my life. If you commit it, and that's what Jonathan Sachs would have said that. If we don't follow a code of morality that has been passed down to us by generations that preceded us, you don't get mitzvah points as being a good Jew. I don't care how many pairs of tefillin you put on every morning. That doesn't cut it. So there is a moral but there are red lines which I think are pretty self-evident in most cases. But in general, I think we have to be flexible in terms of people who don't adhere to our standard of observance or practice, to our level of to our politics in terms of Israel. Israel had a very challenging election. I don't even know what the final results are. We think we know where they're leaning. If you're a supporter of Lapid, if you're of Bibi, to me that doesn't qualify. It's nothing to do with you being a good Jew or a bad Jew. It means you're a political Jew. I've met Lapid. I have my picture taken with Bibi Netanyahu twice. So I've met both. I have no problem. I don't agree politically with. I will have points of disagreement with either one of them. That doesn't qualify one as being a good Jew or a bad Jew. So I think we have to be very careful. There are red lines, clearly. So my summation, I think we're out of time, but my summation will be, again, as I said earlier, must a good Jew believe in God? Maybe, maybe not. But that's probably going to be my answer to every question in the series. Maybe, maybe not. But I think, it is an important question, something we should think about, and something that we should talk about and not avoid the subject. I want to thank all of you on the Zoom who've been so attentive, and to those who are here live. Maybe some of you others will join us in the live group. We have really amazing cookies here, and because gradually we hope to get back to normalcy. But it's delighted to whichever platform makes you comfortable. I know people here. I know the Kochbergs are in Arizona. I think you're in Arizona, enjoying beautiful weather. Although today was beautiful in Toronto, probably nicer here than there. It's summer. I was doing a funeral, not where you want to be, but I was at the cemetery yesterday and today, unfortunately, and just in a suit without a coat, and I was overheated with just no coat, just in the suit. It was too warm. It was beautiful. So maybe that will continue. Thank you all, and
just on behalf of the Engaging in Education Committee, thank you, Rabbi, for that wonderful wisdoms and words and stories that you shared with us. I remember teaching at Beis Yaakov a couple of years ago, many years ago actually, and one of the songs that they always sang was, God is here, God is there, God is everywhere. So it kind of brings this all together for me. And just remember, we're going to hear Rabbi again on November the 16th, so 2 weeks from now.
And the subject that night, thank you, Heather. The subject that night is Zionism a central Jewish principle? We've kind of led into that discussion with our comments at the end tonight. Is Zionism a central Jewish principle? And there I may have a more definitive answer for you, which you probably can guess. But see you if not before, we'll see you in a couple of weeks. Stay safe, stay healthy, everybody. Those in the room and those in the virtual room. Erev Tov, good night to everybody, and stay well.
Thanks.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Right, thank you.
Good night. Thank you very
Good night.
much.
Everyone.
Good night, everyone.
Night, thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Unbelievable. I don't hear much about him these days, but I guess it's...
In light of what you said, have they gone and figured out the 611 or 613?
Well, there are,
Is there actually a
Well, there are
list?
books. There are a couple of books. There's one called his Sefer HaMitzvot. There's another one called, oh my God, I can't think of the name. I have it in my library. A medieval authority published his book of Mitzvot. There are a few people who did Compos Sadigon did a few. medieval sages in particular who outlined 613 commandments, had their version of what the 613 are, and they have to and there'll be
But
disagreement.
they sort of
If you
come
look-
like with a, because they've taken those letters and sort of kind of forced to get.
No, it is forced. It's definitely forced. If you go in Encyclopedia Judaica, look up commandments in these, and there's a whole chart showing the various compilations of how they get to 613. It's forced, but it's very interesting.
Okay.
How they figure out how do you make 613, and they will all differ. Is this a mitzvah? Is this two mitzvot? There's all kinds of. And they show Maimonides. They'll show you other different authorities, Rashbam and others who have their own versions of what make up the 613.
Okay.
Makes life interesting. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for being here. Oh, it's wonderful to be here in person. And thank all of you for, I hope you enjoyed being.
You'll help tie up the 100 blankets.